In 1986, the CIA gave Afghan fighters Stinger missiles. The missiles could shoot down Soviet helicopters. They worked. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. The CIA called Operation Cyclone one of its greatest successes. The fighters the CIA armed, trained, and funded across 10 years became, some of them, through a chain of connections, ideology, and organizational evolution that the CIA either did not foresee or chose not to foresee, the Taliban and the network that sheltered al-Qaeda. On September 11, 2001, 19 men who were connected to that network flew planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. 2,977 people died. The CIA spent $6 billion arming the people who created the conditions for 9/11. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the specific chain of events that American policymakers, historians, and intelligence officials have documented, debated, and in some cases celebrated and in other cases regretted across the decades since 1979. This is the story of Operation Cyclone, the most expensive covert operation in CIA history, and of what it built, and what it broke, and what it left behind. On December 25, 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, a Marxist government that had come to power in a coup in 1978, had been struggling to consolidate control against rural resistance. Soviet advisors had been present since the coup. By December 1979, with the government in crisis and its leader Hafizullah Amin viewed by Moscow as unreliable, the Soviet Union sent the 40th Army across the border. Soviet special forces killed Amin on the first night of the invasion. A more reliable communist government was installed. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's problem. It became America's opportunity. President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had actually begun authorizing covert support for Afghan resistance fighters on July 3, 1979, months before the Soviet invasion formally began. When the invasion occurred, Brzezinski wrote a memo to Carter that became one of the most quoted documents in Cold War history. It said, "We now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War." The analogy was deliberate and the intent was explicit. The United States would arm, train, and fund the Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen, to make the Soviet occupation as costly as possible. Not to win the war for Afghanistan. To bleed the Soviet Union. The Afghans would do the bleeding too. That was understood. Operation Cyclone, the CIA's covert program to support the Mujahideen, began with $20 to $30 million per year in 1980. By 1987, it had risen to $630 million per year. Over the full course of the program, the United States spent approximately $6 billion funding the Afghan resistance. Saudi Arabia matched American contributions dollar for dollar. Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, served as the primary conduit, receiving CIA funds and weapons and distributing them to the Afghan factions it selected. The specific decision about which factions to support was made primarily by the ISI, with American acquiescence. The ISI favored the most extreme Islamist factions, groups aligned with a radical political Islam that Pakistan's military ruler Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq saw as aligned with his own political goals. The more moderate, nationalist, or secular Afghan resistance groups received less support. The CIA knew this. The CIA accepted it. The strategic logic was that the most extreme factions were also the most effective fighters. The strategic logic was not wrong about the fighting. It was silent about what would happen when the fighting was over. The Afghan people were not objects in someone else's Cold War. They were a country that had been invaded. Between 1979 and 1989, the Soviet military conducted a counterinsurgency campaign against the Afghan population that scholars have described as amounting to genocide. The Soviets bombed villages indiscriminately. They laid landmines across agricultural land. They targeted irrigation systems that Afghan farming communities depended on. They conducted massacres of civilian populations in areas suspected of supporting the Mujahideen. Between 562,000 and 2 million Afghans died in the conflict. 5 million were externally displaced, the largest refugee crisis in the world at the time. 2 million more were internally displaced. The specific human cost of the Soviet occupation, borne overwhelmingly by the Afghan civilian population, was the context within which Operation Cyclone operated. The CIA was arming fighters who were defending their country against a brutal occupation. That was real. What was also real was who those fighters were, what they believed, and what some of them would do when the Soviet occupation ended and the American money stopped. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The most significant single weapons decision of Operation Cyclone was the 1986 authorization to supply the Mujahideen with FIM-92 Stinger missiles. The Stinger was a man-portable, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile capable of shooting down Soviet helicopters and low-flying aircraft. The Soviet military's air power, its Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships in particular, had been one of its most effective tools against the Mujahideen. The Stingers negated that advantage. Soviet helicopter losses increased sharply after the Stingers arrived. The military calculus of the conflict shifted. The Soviet military, which had been conducting its counterinsurgency campaign with relative air superiority, now had to operate differently, flying higher, attacking less precisely, losing the tactical flexibility that low-altitude operations had provided. The change was not decisive on its own, but it was significant. Combined with the enormous financial, logistical, and political costs of a 9-year occupation that had killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and produced no resolution, and combined with the broader crisis of the Soviet system that Mikhail Gorbachev was attempting to address through glasnost and perestroika, the Stingers contributed to the Soviet decision to withdraw. The Soviet withdrawal began in May 1988. It was completed on February 15, 1989. The last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge at Termez, Uzbekistan, on that date. The commander of Soviet forces in Afghanistan, General Boris Gromov, walked across last. The American foreign policy establishment celebrated. The Cold War had produced a decisive victory in one of its proxy theaters. The CIA's covert operation had worked. The aftermath nobody planned for. What the American foreign policy establishment had not planned for was what came next. When the Soviet Union withdrew, the American money stopped. The various Mujahideen factions that had been united, however incompletely, by the common enemy of Soviet occupation lost that unifying enemy and turned on each other. The civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal killed an estimated 50,000 people in Kabul alone between 1992 and 1996 as Mujahideen factions, including the ISI-favored Hezb-e Islami of Gabud and Hekmatyar, shelled the capital from the surrounding hills. Into this chaos, in 1994, emerged the Taliban. The Taliban drew on the ideological infrastructure that the ISI and Saudi Arabia had built across the refugee camps and madrasas of Pakistan during the 1980s, the religious schools where millions of Afghan refugees had received an education shaped by the same radical Islamist ideology that the ISI had promoted among the Mujahideen factions. By 1996, the Taliban had taken Kabul. By 1998, they were sheltering Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. On August 7, 1998, al-Qaeda bombed the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing 224 people. On September 11, 2001, 19 men associated with al-Qaeda flew planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. The weapons the CIA had supplied to the Mujahideen were not the weapons used on September 11. The connection between Operation Cyclone and September 11 is not a direct line. It is a chain of ideology, organization, radicalization, and the specific consequences of arming the most extreme Islamist factions available and then withdrawing American engagement the moment the Cold War objective had been achieved. The specific question of whether the CIA's choice to fund the most extreme Islamist factions, rather than the more moderate resistance groups that were also available, directly contributed to what followed is the question that has not been satisfactorily answered. Brzezinski, when asked in 1998 whether he regretted Operation Cyclone given what had emerged from it, said he did not. He said, "What was more important in world history? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire?" He said, "A few stirred-up Muslims?" He said it in 1998, 3 years before September 11. The 9/11 Commission, the independent bipartisan commission established by the United States Congress to investigate the September 11th attacks, addressed the question of the relationship between Operation Cyclone and al-Qaeda's development. Its finding was measured. The commission found that the CIA's support for the Mujahideen had not directly funded or trained al-Qaeda. The specific claim that Osama bin Laden personally received CIA support, a claim that circulated widely, was not established by the Commission's investigation. What the Commission did establish was the broader context, that the radicalization infrastructure built during the 1980s in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the madrasas, the foreign fighter networks, the specific ideological formation of a generation of fighters in the name of Islamic resistance against Soviet occupation, had created the environment from which al-Qaeda had emerged. The specific connection is not a direct line. It is a context. Whether context constitutes responsibility, whether the United States bears moral or causal responsibility for September 11 through its choices in the 1980s, is a question that American political discourse has never been able to address cleanly, because the answer is uncomfortable from every political direction. The CIA called Operation Cyclone one of its greatest successes. The Soviet Union withdrew. The Cold War battlefield of Afghanistan produced the outcome American policy sought. Zbigniew Brzezinski died in 2017. He never expressed regret for Operation Cyclone. Robert Gates, who served in the CIA during the Operation Cyclone period and later became Director of Central Intelligence and Secretary of Defense under both Bush and Obama, wrote in his memoir that the United States had indeed, through its support for the Mujahideen, contributed to conditions that had consequences America had not intended and did not foresee. He did not call it a mistake. He called it a consequence. The distinction matters. A mistake implies a decision that was wrong at the time. A consequence implies a decision that may have been right at the time and produced outcomes that were not anticipated. Whether Operation Cyclone was a mistake or a consequence of a correct decision is the question that American foreign policy has been living inside ever since. Afghanistan still is. Operation Cyclone worked. By the specific measure it was designed to meet, making Soviet occupation of Afghanistan unsustainably costly, contributing to Soviet withdrawal, bleeding the Soviet Empire, it worked. The Soviet Union withdrew in 1989. 2 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Whether Operation Cyclone contributed to the Soviet collapse is debated. What is not debated is that the Soviet-Afghan War was one of the most significant drains on Soviet resources, morale, and international credibility of the late Cold War period. The CIA spent $6 billion. It achieved its Cold War objective. And then the Afghan civil war killed 50,000 people in Kabul. And then the Taliban emerged. And then al-Qaeda found shelter there. And then came September 11th. And then came the American invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. And then came 20 years of American military presence in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. And then, on August 30th, 2021, the last American military aircraft left Kabul. The Taliban were back in power. The country that Operation Cyclone had used as the terrain for a Cold War proxy battle looked, in certain specific respects, remarkably similar to what it had looked like before the Soviets arrived. Except for the specific things that 40 years of continuous war had done to it. Brzezinski asked, what was more important, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? He framed it as a choice. The people of Afghanistan did not get to make that choice. They got the Taliban, and the Soviet occupation, and the Civil War, and 20 years of American military presence, and the Taliban again. The $6 billion that bought the Cold War victory was not their $6 billion. The consequences were